About 6 months ago, I reviewed The Jungle Book on this channel, and in case you missed it, I'll leave a link in the description down below. But today I'm going to be talking about the second Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. Now, in my conversations with friends, I've discovered that a lot of people don't know that there is a second Jungle Book. This is, as the name would imply, a sequel to The Jungle Book. So, if memory serves, The Jungle Book was originally published in 1894. The second Jungle Book was published the year after in 1895. So there are actually two Jungle Books, although depending on what edition you read or what edition you buy, quite often these are combined. So when I first read the Jungle Books back when I was in 6th grade, it was an edition from my local library that combined both the first Jungle Book and the second Jungle Book into one binding, and it was called The Jungle Books, plural. So perhaps that's the edition you read, or you can also get them separately as they were originally published, the first Jungle Book and then the second Jungle Book. Just out of curiosity, let me know in the comments, what edition did you read? Did you read these two separately? Did you read them combined as the Jungle Books? Did you know there was a first and a second Jungle Book? I'm just always curious what other people's perception of these things are. But anyways, talking today about the second Jungle Book. So, this is published only 1 year after the original Jungle Book, and like I said, in a lot of modern editions, it's combined with the original Jungle Book. And yet, the stories in here are probably less familiar than the ones that were in the first Jungle Book. So, as I said in my review of the first Jungle Book, Walt Disney, when he was making his movie, The Jungle Book, apparently told his crew, he said, "Here's a copy of Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book. The first thing I want you to do is not to read it." So, implying that Walt Disney did not want his animated film to be closely based on the novel. He wanted his story writers to diverge from the source material. And yet, if you read the original Jungle Book, you can see that even though the tone of the stories is quite different, the story beats and the characters are more or less the same. So, Mowgli is abandoned by a child. He's found by Bagheera and taken to the wolf pack. He has a brief excursion where he's abducted by the monkeys and has to be rescued by Baloo and Bagheera. And then in the final, there's a showdown between Mowgli and Shere Khan. Now, it's aside from that basic outline, the movie and the original novel diverge quite a bit, but it's still recognizable. Whereas the stories in the second Jungle Book, even the Mowgli stories, are movies that are not usually adapted for film, or at least not for the animated films. Although, if anyone out there remembers the 1994 live-action Disney movie, The Jungle Book, which probably isn't very remembered nowadays, especially by people who were born after 1994, but I saw it in theaters when it originally came out and vaguely remember some of it. That movie actually was based off of a couple stories in the second Jungle Book. So I guess it has been adapted for film at least once. But anyways, let's talk about these stories. So in the second Jungle Book, there are 5 Mowgli stories, which is actually 2 more than were in the original Jungle Book. In the original Jungle Book, we only got 3 Mowgli stories. In the second Jungle Book, we get 5 more Mowgli stories, so that's more Mowgli stories. Now, the original Jungle Book had the Mowgli stories, and then it also had assorted animal stories at the end. 4, if memory serves. The second Jungle Book has three animal stories, non-related to Mowgli, and those are actually interspersed within the Mowgli stories. So there's a difference in formatting. The original Jungle Book had the three Mowgli stories all at the beginning, and then the other animal stories at the end. The second Jungle Book has Mowgli story, animal story, Mowgli story, animal story, Mowgli story, animal story, and then two Mowgli stories to finish it off. Although, again, maybe this differs depending on which edition you get. Let me know if the ordering of your edition was different. But anyways, we'll talk about the Mowgli stories first, even though as you read them, the Mowgli stories are interspersed with the other stories. So the first one is How Fear Came. Now, this is jumping backwards a little bit in the chronology. So in the Jungle Book, at the end of the Mowgli stories, Shere Khan was killed by Mowgli. Spoilers. Here we're jumping back in the chronology, back when Shere Khan was still alive. And there is a drought going on in the jungle. So all the animals are congregated by the water hole, and there's a peacetime truce that's going on. So the animals are not allowed to kill each other at the watering hole during the drought season. It's one of the laws of the jungle. That's one of the lore of the Jungle Books, is that there's all these jungle laws. Now, Shere Khan comes up to the water having just killed a man, and he's bragging about how he killed a man. And Hayatha, who's the elephant, and he's the king of the jungle, he acknowledges that it is Shere Khan's right. And then after Shere Khan goes away, everyone else is curious. They said, wait, I thought, according to the law of the jungle, you weren't supposed to kill a man. And Hayatha explains this origin story about the origin of the jungle and the origin of man. And according to this ancient legend, why the tiger has the right to kill a man once every year. And it's interesting in that it's not really a Mowgli story. It's kind of a story within a story. So Mowgli asking questions about this story is kind of like the frame. And then the main story is this jungle myth, which is in the frame of a Mowgli story. Sorry, it's framed around by the Mowgli story. That is busy now, Rosa. No. That is busy now. I don't have editing equipment, so if I get interrupted, I'm just going to have to go with that. I did tell them beforehand that I was going to be filming a video, but kids. Anyways, oh yeah, the tone of the story resembles the Just So stories, which is Rudyard Kipling's other famous children's stories. And according to Wikipedia, this book was published before the Just So stories. And so in a way, that first story can be seen as a early example of one of the Just So stories. Okay, then we have Letting in the Jungle. That's the next Mowgli story. And this picks up directly from the events in the first Jungle Book. Now, let me backtrack and maybe say something that I should have said earlier. This is not so much a novel as it is a collection of independent stories. It's more of a story book than it is a novel. Now, there are the Mowgli stories, which do have a continuity to them, and were reference to events that took place in previous stories, etc. But these stories were all originally published separately in magazines, as a lot of Victorian books were, I think. And then later collected into the books, the Jungle Book and the second Jungle Book. So even though the Mowgli stories do have a continuity between them, they should be read as separate stories that were originally published in magazines to be read independently. Well, sorry, not quite independently, because they do call back to previous stories, but read as a contained story instead of like a normal novel where there's chapters building up to a climax. So this is, maybe contained story is the wrong word, because this is directly continuing off of events from the previous Jungle Book. But it is its own story arc. And this is after the events of the original Jungle Book. Mowgli had tried to enter the man's village. He had gotten rejected by the people in the village who didn't trust his jungle ways. But he did have an adoptive mother and father who took him in because the head shaman said that perhaps this jungle boy was the spirit of their child who was carried off by a tiger at the age of 3. Now, I'd be interested in hearing other people's interpretations of this. I've looked it up on Wikipedia. I didn't get any information on Wikipedia. I didn't go any deeper than that. But my interpretation is that it's left deliberately ambiguous whether or not Mowgli actually is their natural son. Because Mowgli's origin story is that his parents got scared off by a tiger when he was about 3. His adoptive parents in the village have a child who was carried off by a tiger at the age of 3. I think we, the reader, are left to infer that there is a possibility that Mowgli is actually their child. The alternative explanation is a little bit dark. The alternative explanation is that they had a 3-year-old child who just got carried off and eaten by the tiger. But, you know, there are some dark moments in the Jungle Book. So it's not inconceivable that is what happened to their natural child. But anyways, they especially the woman, feel that Mowgli is their child returning from the jungle. And they look at him as, they adopt him as if he was their own child. Now that's all in the first Jungle Book. And at the end of that, Mowgli gets driven away by rocks by the villagers and goes back into the jungle. Now, in the sequel story here in the second Jungle Book, he finds out that his adoptive parents have been tied up by the villagers who think that they are sorcerers or witches because of their connections to this mysterious jungle boy. They're planning on burning them alive, and they also send a hunter into the jungle to get Mowgli. That hunter, his name starts with a B. It's something like Bundillo or something like that. He also has a rivalry with Mowgli, which again was established in one of the stories from the first Jungle Book. So he goes into the jungle to find Mowgli. Mowgli and his animal friends lead the hunter on a chase. And then Mowgli goes and he frees his adoptive parents. And they have to now flee their village. And Mowgli gives them safe passage in the jungle. He said, you can go through the jungle, nothing in the jungle will harm you. And the husband, who doesn't have quite the bond with Mowgli that the mother does, is skeptical. So Mowgli has to do some convincing to convince them that the jungle is actually safe for them now. That Mowgli is actually in control of all the jungle creatures and that nothing will harm them. The mother believes him a little bit more quickly. They eventually do get convinced to go on their journey. And then Mowgli takes an act of revenge on the village. Now, he doesn't want to kill anyone. He has an aversion to killing. But he does get the jungle elephants, Hayata and his 3 sons, to let the jungle end, to get all the jungle animals to flood through the village, destroy everything, cause all the villagers to have to flee elsewhere, and then the jungle takes back over the village. So that's Mowgli's revenge on the village which has turned him away and which intended to burn his adoptive parents alive. There is, maybe this is as good a time as any to mention it, arguably some colonial attitudes in here. And some colonial attitudes maybe all through the Jungle Book, although it's complicated. It's complicated, and it's probably more complicated than even I realize, because I'm sure there are people who have studied this more in depth than I have. Because Rudyard Kipling did have a colonialist attitude, I think, but he also had a great love for India and its native people, and I think respected it to a great deal. Again, I'm sure somebody out there knows more about this than I do. But it's referenced a couple times that the English do not allow people to be burned without evidence. And so the villagers regard this as kind of like a nuisance. Like, oh, those silly English, they won't let us burn people anymore without evidence. Like, what is the world coming to? Of course, the Mowgli's adoptive parents, I keep saying adoptive parents, who are fleeing, look to the English as their saviors. And of course, Kipling, who is the author of all of this, is kind of setting this up as, these are the barbaric attitudes of burning people without evidence. The English are enlightened and they stop this kind of thing from happening. Now, lest I sound too politically correct, I should probably acknowledge that I think that actually is historical, right? The English actually did kind of curb some of these practices like that, which were probably best curbed. Well, yeah. I'm going down here a rabbit hole, which maybe I shouldn't go down, which is trying to examine the politics of the Jungle Book and Rudyard Kipling. And let's be honest, I've not researched this enough to have an informed opinion. Let's just move on. Let's move on. Forget I went down that rabbit hole. Let's go on to the next Mowgli story, which is the King's Ankus. Now, this is a good story. And again, although the arc within the story is kind of a contained story arc, it does reference back to previous stories in the previous Jungle Book. So in the previous Jungle Book, it was established that the monkeys had their city in the ruins of what was originally some sort of ancient city, which has since been overtaken by the jungle. It was also established that there were snakes, they would call them, I think, the poison people, in the basements of the ruins of that. And we are now returning to that ruined city, where Kaa, the boa constrictor, is taking Mowgli. Now, if you're only familiar with the Disney version, it may be useful to just remind that in the book, Kaa is actually a good guy. I know in the Disney movie, Kaa was trying to eat Mowgli, but in the book, Kaa is one of Mowgli's friends. So Kaa is familiar with the middle jungle, which is the land kind of under the trees and under everything. So he knows all this whole kind of hidden world in the jungle. And Kaa is familiar with there's some sort of buried treasure in this ancient city. And Kaa takes Mowgli there where there's this cobra guarding the treasure. And the cobra there is so ancient that the cobra was actually placed there to guard the treasure by a king. And it's not clearly stated how long the cobra has been there, but it's implied it's been for centuries at least. Now, I don't know what the natural lifespan of a cobra is. I don't think it's centuries. Maybe for the sake of fiction, we're taking some liberties, assuming that snakes are more long-lived than they actually are. I guess that's what we're doing. But the cobra has not been back up to see the city. So the cobra keeps talking about this powerful city up above where there's this very powerful king. And Kaa and Mowgli keep trying to convince the cobra, there's no city up there anymore. There's just ruins and a bunch of trees. Except that that's not exactly the words they use, because Kaa and Mowgli don't really understand that they're in the ruins of this great city. They just see that there's a bunch of trees that have grown up around all these strange structures. And the cobra keeps refusing to believe them, because the cobra views this kind of city as being eternal. And I'm not doing it justice here in my description, but as you read the conversation between Mowgli and Kaa and the cobra, you get this sense of this very great, majestic city which had once been there and is now completely lost to memory. The humans don't remember that it had been there. The jungle has completely overtaken it. And all that's left is just this cobra who thinks he's guarding a treasure for kings who no longer exist above him. And it reminded me of something I mentioned in my review of the first Jungle Book, which is an essay by BookTube's very own Steve Donahue on the Jungle Book, where Steve Donahue argued that the Jungle Book was actually the forerunner of the modern fantasy genre for a few reasons. Now, it's not fantasy in the sense that there are no elves or wizards or goblins or anything like that, but it's fantasy in the sense that there's this whole world building around the jungle. And even though the creatures are not magical, it's bears and wolves and snakes and just recognizable animals, they have this whole society and all these laws and all this history and their own mythology, which makes this animal world into this fantasy world in a way that Steve Donahue argues was the precursor to the modern fantasy genre. And especially when you're reading this particular story, The King's Ankus, and how this cobra is thinking he's in this big city and the city is actually in ruins all around him. I mean, you can't help but think of like the Tolkien's books, when Tolkien's characters have stumbled into the ruins of some great city that is only faintly remembered nowadays. It's very much that same atmosphere, I feel. And then there's a rather interesting story where Mowgli gets one of the treasures out, and then in the jungle he loses the treasure, and a man gets the treasure, and then there's a whole group of men which are killing each other one after the other to get this treasure, and Mowgli and Kaa, who are kind of tracking the men to kind of see where they had gone, and they're discovering these dead bodies as they go, and they're realizing that the men keep killing each other to obtain this treasure, come to the conclusion that this treasure is cursed, which is what the cobra had told them when they took it, that the treasure was cursed. And it's interesting because Rudyard Kipling, the author, is meant to signal to the reader that the treasure isn't actually cursed. It's just men are greedy and men are willing to kill each other for monetary gain. But Mowgli and Kaa, kind of watching the whole thing unfold or discovering it afterwards as they reconstruct the tracks, are concluding that the object itself is cursed and that the object is what's causing the death of men. And so in the end, they return the cursed object to the snake. Now, maybe somebody out there on BookTube can help me. I swear there's a similar story to this somewhere. I can't remember where. It's one of those things that's in the back of my mind, it's bugging me. There's some sort of similar story, right? Another famous story about some sort of men getting treasure and then one by one killing each other to obtain that treasure. And I I've searched Google, I've looked this book on Wikipedia, I can't seem to trace it at the moment. Help me out if you can remember what that is. I feel that there's some sort of very similar story to this somewhere. Okay, and then the next Mowgli story is about the red dogs, who are called in this book Dholes. That's Dholes. Now, Rudyard Kipling uses a lot of his own names for the animals in this book. And a lot of, actually, they're not really his own names. They come from the Hindu words, the Indian words. But I looked this up on the internet because sometimes you have to look things up to find out what Rudyard Kipling is talking about. And dholes are actually, apparently that is the English word for them as well. Dholes. There's some sort of red dog. And they are swarming the jungle like a pack, killing everything that they come across. They're described kind of like a pack of jackals. But I guess they're different than jackals. They're dholes. Interestingly enough, when I looked this up on Wikipedia, I found out that dholes are now an endangered animal. For whatever reason, I guess a lot can change in 130 years. At the time when Rudyard Kipling was writing this book, you get the impression from Rudyard Kipling that these are dangerous pests. Some sort of animal that's in danger of taking over the whole jungle and needs to be combated. So Mowgli and the wolf pack need to fight these wild jackal red dogs who are overwhelming the jungle. And Kaa, again, Kaa's one of the good guys in the books. He helps Mowgli come up with a plan where they lure the dogs into the bees area. And again, I don't know how accurate this is to real life, but in the book, the bees are portrayed as like killer bees, like literally killer bees. They just kind of swarm and kill everything that gets near their hive. So Mowgli leads the dogs on and gets them to the hive where they get attacked. But once again, that short summary I just gave now does not do justice to everything that's in this story. There's a lot of back and forth between Mowgli and the wolf pack when Mowgli is talking about the fight. There's some back and forth when Mowgli is taunting the red dogs. My short synopsis of the plot isn't doing this justice, but it's a lot of fun to read. And maybe this is a little bit late in the review to be mentioning this little detail, but this book reads quite well. As I said with my review of the original Jungle Book, Rudyard Kipling's prose is good, for lack of a better word. It's good. It reads well. It's not too difficult. There's a certain elegance in it. It's a children's book, but because I think writing was more complex in 1895 than it is now, I don't think it's ideal for children nowadays. Although I first read it when I was in 6th grade, and I enjoyed it at the time. But I think the prose complexity is maybe equal to what would be considered an adult book now, even though the stories are a little bit more simple. I guess what I'm saying is, well, what am I saying? I think for maybe middle school on, the prose in this book is quite pleasant and easy to read, and it reads very smoothly. Originally, it was probably published for a younger audience, but I think because of the way writing has gotten simpler over time, it would no longer be very readable for an elementary child now. But the prose reads quite good. I'm out of time. My camera is going to automatically shut off when I get to 30 minutes. And I have not talked about the whole book yet. There's still a few more stories I haven't gotten to, including the non-Mowgli stories in this book. But that's okay. You can't talk about everything. 30 minutes is more than enough for one man to ramble about one book. So I'm going to call it good here. Thank you very much, BookTube, and tell me what you think about this book.